Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for having me here again. I'm very pleased to be back after the encore conference on pragmatism and utopia. And I'm also thankful for this presentation before me that somehow frame the context of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm thinking about the references that Professor Junz made to the non-stable, to the co-evolutionary, to the plural, the non-human, and maybe the multi-species. And also Professor Depuy through Illich, this call to oxymoronically reinterpret probably also the concepts such as death, as we said, somehow frame this discourse on transductive architecture that I started looking at, well, okay, an expression that I found in a letter, The Integrity of the Undoer, is an expression I found in a 1960 letter to V.H. Oden, in which Hannah Arendt described unsolicited forgiveness as a violation of the integrity of the wrongdoer. Taking issue with the unconditioned understanding of forgiveness that Oden raised in The Fallen City, Arendt portrayed the act of forgiving as a transactional gesture. So, transposing this concept to the built realm, this oxymoronic construct may suggest that integrity is in constant dialectic tension with its opposite self. In other words, betrayal is itself integral to the coherence, the wholeness, and the intactness of the objects that we intend to protect. But when the wrongdoer is the action of time or weather or the inherent fragility of a delicate ecosystem with its cycles and its losses, the contentions may turn into a fruitful one. It means questioning which form of condone or release this destabilization of matter and meaning unavoidably imply for the built legacy to be carried on towards evolutionary futures. On these premises, the hypothesis here sustained is that inside these destabilizations, negotiating with the integrity of the wrongdoer, potential salvage barges can be found for facing risks. And in the same year when Arendt published The Human Condition, Simon Donne, Du mode d'existence des objets techniques, addressed the status of artifacts in a distant yet interestingly comparable way. To investigate the dilemmas and the risks triggered by the apparent opposition of integrity and disintegration, Simon Donne's notion of transductive unity may apply to architecture. While the current upheavals are opening the way for wildness to return to our cities, architecture is called upon to renegotiate new alliances with its living and non-living inhabitants. Multi-species encounters, non-human needs, and unexpected matter out of place emerge from these unorthodox forms of cohabitation, invoking a fundamental overhaul of the material and semiotic substance of spatial theories and practices. And therefore, this way, transduction emerges as a strategy to reread the connection between the necessity of stableness in some forms of the city and the urgencies of accommodating unexpected matter, unexpected subjects, in a process that, looking at Simon Donne's interpretation of transduction, and in this case I'm showing one image from the book about the process of concretization that, as I can quote from this part of the book, are considering at the same time as reducing and disappearing, are at the same time a contrast between active parts that evolve and at the same time the disappearance of the concretization process itself. It is starting on these premises that I reread transducing as a way of producing through crisis. And in order to discuss this notion, of course, I refer to the etymology of the term itself, from Latin, to lead across, to transfer, so composed of trans, across, and the other side, beyond, over, and then ducere, to lead. And we can also see what emerges from the transductor itself, from the dictionary, any device by which variation in one physical quantity are quantitatively converted into variations in another. And in the verb form, to alter the physical nature of a medium, of a signal, into corresponding variations in another medium. And the notion of transduction, in my opinion, is fertile as it refers also to other fields. We can borrow from biology, where it means the transfer of genetic material from one cell to another by a virus or a virus-like particle, or psychology, where it is a purely mental experiment by which we mean that it begins by simply reproducing in imagination events such as they are or could be presented by immediate reality. And while I am looking into the dictionary, I'm at the same time looking at the project that Lebeus would envisioned for La Habana, for paradoxically protecting the city of La Habana by floods. The notion of transduction through Gilbert Simondon somehow differs from the interpretation of Deleuze and Guattari. If we have in these letters that transduction is the manner in which one milieu serves as the basis for another, or conversely is established atop another milieu, dissipates it, or is it constituted in it, in Simondon, transduction maps out the actual course that invention follows. And in this connection to the idea of invention, I see a potential for architecture. And so rereading, for instance, Simondon through the thought of Tissot is the possibility of rereading spatial categories that may emerge. And here I come to the notion of becoming that I was framing in the subtitle of this intervention. As the idea of proceeding through crisis is exactly coming from when Simondon is describing a theory of the phases of becoming, in which becoming is something other than an alteration or a succession of states comparable to a series development. And it's rather a perpetuated and renovated resolution, an incorporating resolution that proceeds through crisis. And in order to spatialize and to read through the matter beyond the metaphor in the tissues of an existing space, of an existing urban and non-urban space, I was rereading Venice as a potential paradigm for the potentialities of metastable becomings in a territory which is inherently shaped by risks, a territory in which the adjustable foundations are at the same time a metastable ground and a constant danger. And while I was thinking about Venice, I was comparing the Freudian sentence about the need, about the principal raison d'être of the civilization as defending us against nature to what a 15th century edict of the Venetian magistrate of the waters was saying about the city of the Venetians as protected by these waters in place of a wall. So on the one hand, I was looking at Lebeau's food project for La Habana, in which the wall is built to protect from flooding, and on the other side, the city of Venice, where from its foundation and from the continuous modification that constantly deal with the strive towards eternity somehow, can be seen as a way of facing risks and maybe embracing risks, embracing the potentialities hidden in reversing the challenges and the from collapse to new fruitful opportunities. And for sure, the city of Venice has been the subject of many, this topic also, and negatively paradoxical interpretations of the boundary between the power of nature and the possibility of manipulation of the humankind, such as the Atlantropa project by Sorgel, that was protecting Venice as a trason against the transformation of everything that was around it. Or in another way, also the premises of Scherbart's glass architecture, in which it was envisioned a doppelganger Venice that was going to obscure and annihilate the existing one. So against these falsifications and these manipulations of the original matter is the discovery, probably, of the city itself, as Simmel posed it, as a flower in the sea, as out of matter, as weeds, more than as a flower, I would argue. And so we discover also in the possibility hidden in the multiple manipulation of what is supposedly, allegedly, authentic. Such as in the project by James Wines, the proposal for the Molinos Castaki, in which a gradually collapsing, fading facade, or the possibility of subverting completely the horizontal and vertical order of the built realm to break the boundary between the built and the unbuilt. Or again, if we think of Superstudio's paradoxical proposition for an oxymoronic form of preservation in which the city of Venice is paved to be saved by the flooding. And here again, I could see the joyous death of architecture in this interpretation, or from the 9999 salvage of Venice, how this nature becomes another form of rescue strategies, replacing the danger of the waters, up to much more recent proposals, such as Rachel Armstrong Future Venice, that envisions an underground system to protect the lagoon. Against this background of this proposal, I've been trying to apply Simondonian's notion of individuation to the four levels of individuation, according to Simondon, to the projects, to the tetralogy for Venice by John Haydock. But there's a transition between the sequence of visionary project at the crossroad between utopia and dystopian that I've been showing until now, I was finding in the words of Raymond Abraham and the project for the Venice as a city of twofold vision, some notion that then I will try to carry on towards the final part. The idea of this stoic isolation that Abraham is mentioning in the final lines of the insular bodies between unknown horizon, and therefore the city in which the twofold vision is at the same time conceived as internally reflected, can take us to the final chapter of this tentative structure, this ongoing structure, in which transduction becomes the vehicle to reread, for instance, an idea of becoming that through the Simonian notion of the physical becomes a becoming scattered. As it happens in Heideck project for the 13 watchtowers of Cannareggio in Venice, in which the system of protection is found in the towers themselves and in the correspondence of forms of isolations and forms of aggregation. Or we can see again the level of the biological that takes Heideck to envision rereading the project of reading the painting of George Braque, in which a bird is trapped into the walls of a room, can lead us to the idea of a becoming winged as a possibility in between forms of death and forms of resurrection. And I'm quoting here the project of the Cemetery for the Ashes of Thought. Or what I was defining as a form of becoming deep skin, a psychic level that a part of the project for Cannareggio, detached from it, the house of the inhabitant who refused to participate, becomes a way of rereading a depth and the possibility at the same time of the individual facing risks, and then at the last level of the collective. The possibilities of architectures of dusk, of crystallization, in which the boundaries between vision and invisibility are blurred. And for instance, in the project for the new town, for the new Orthodox, what is Heideck envisioning is similar to what Nietzsche was defining for Venice as a system of 100,000 solitudes. Here we have 18,000 identical units that together express at the same time forms of isolation and the possibilities, again, of the collective. And coming to an end, I'm already in the final part. I was considering this miniature Venetian palace that in this artwork by Andy Arnowitz strapped into a snow globe, and then the title adaptation, but rather than a column of smoke, a tree emerges from it. So in this apparently dichotomous opposition between permanence and becoming, The premises are led for thinking about the afterlives of architecture at the crossroads of preservation and co-evolution, starting from a city whose very essence is a perpetual state of disintegration, an unstable stableness, a continuous becoming. And therefore Venice, with its limited footprint, as a paradigm for architecture and urban heritage that has necessarily to be reborn within itself in a potentially endless cycle, and at the same time as a meta-city able to embody the environmental challenges of these present times, emerging as a laboratory for the futures and a place where to face risk. And I thank you.
Stefania Varvaro et Michele Ugolini. Je vais parler d'un groupe de recherche de Polytechnique.
We'll be talking about the Polytechnic in Milan, Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. Before we start, and we'll be speaking English, we'd like to thank the organizers for kindly inviting us.
Our intervention has the title Strategies for an Urban Sustainable Scenario Post-Pandemic. Our question, the first question that we have in our mind, starting with this research, is which project culture could be necessary today to absorb and acknowledge the requests put in place by the pandemic and to promote processes of a real transformation? Is an ambitious question, of course, but the first result of our research led and carried out from the topic that we can read in coltivaresalute.com, that means cultivating health, and .com means it means a community. So the title is City and Healthcare Center for Resilient Community. The Healthcare Center as builders of urbanity and widespread society in the post-pandemic 99 era. New peripheral centralities in healthy and integrated city. Is a part of the commitment and social responsibility program of the Politecnico di Milano, and is called the program Polysocial Award 2020. So is a kind of occasion and is necessary to make some premises to make clear our reasoning by establishing some key passage among the declaration of the World Health Organization, including that health is not understood only as absence of disease, but a state of psychophysical and social well-being. And another point is from the Ottawa Charter, and the stress that the condition and the resources that are fundamental to health and are peace, shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice and equity. Of course, as architect, we push more sustainable resource, and we are working on a stable ecosystem. The strategies for a sustainable scenario finds a crucial node for us in the healthcare centers. This is the reason because we have this framework as an international reality. First of all, it is necessary to clarify that the health center are spread in all the context in Europe, but they originated in Britain. They are a widespread reality through Europe and take care the primary health. Therefore, they interpret territorial health care. Their main character is to be widespread in the area. So, referring to Italy, the Italian Ministry of Health in 2006 identify healthcare center as operational tools in a territory capable of providing services, but above all of integrating the health and social aspect, of educating about health and prevention, making people responsible for conscious lifestyle. So the center role of the health care center are and what they should be, we have to say, because not all the points are respected still now. So they are first access to primary care in the area, so in the territory. They take care a network at home, so integration with the territory is particularly important. Integration between general practitioner, that is a link really important between people and territory, so between people and city. Taking care of chronic disease and elderly people, and once again, is an important topic because especially in Europe, we are really old, we are a condition of old people. Management of social and social health services, development of health prevention, promotion and education, and citizen participation. The last 2 points are also points on which architects and urban planners can develop and can push more maybe than other, more linked to the sanitary topic and medicine. So the pandemic emergency, we need to add another premises to our work. So the pandemic emergency revealed the fragility of the health system, especially the primary system, and the collective lifestyle. So all school, work, place where we were a lot, so we are crowded, we have a crowded condition. Highlighting that health and society are intimately interconnected and that health is a decisive factor for society full development. So people health become a primary need, so we have a kind of occasion from a very bad condition that we lived. And its protection, the main goal, starting with the reinterpretation of the relationship between with the territory as a necessary condition to be pursued. In Italy, we have this professor that is Gavino Maciocco, that is a professor of hygiene and public health, that spoke before the pandemic and predicted how the lack of funding in the last 20 years, so especially in Italy, this happened, to support the primary care in the case of exceptional events would lead to the collapse of general health system, primary hospital, and it happens, unfortunately, and we knew really well. So another point to clarify our research is the state of condition of how these healthcare centers are placed in the territory. So within the Italian territory, we considered Emilia-Romagna region because it is the one that has the largest number of healthcare centers. From the analysis of geographical distribution of the healthcare center, it emerged that there is a conceptual whole that show how the healthcare center in urban environments, so in the city, are extremely fragile and hardly identifiable as point of a health system. So we have, in particular, we have to stress the point that only 29, from our research and from the data system, only 29% of the population that live in the urban context is served by the healthcare center, so a really few amount of people. And this is the reason because we want to push exactly on the topic of the city, so working on the network of healthcare center as a new network of poles of urban identity. So this is the relation, healthcare center as a pole of urban identity. For an urban regeneration, of course, we have a work that we want to spread in the territory, so we want to increase and make this new regeneration through this topic that now has emerged by the pandemic. So it's important to, in this sense, we identify an important design theme in the displacement strategy. So in this way, healthcare center can express their potential for urban regeneration that we as architect and urban planner see. So these three decisive actions that find unity in this health center are community, building communities, regenerate city, and increase and communicate the network of public services to bring out the potential articulated system in which citizen and individual and as a community can be inserted. And this is a topic that follows in particular also our last European, but in Italy is declined in this way, so National Recovery Resilience Plans, so plan that in Italy we have a transformation, we change the name, the recovery plan changed the name from healthcare center into community center, in the idea that the health is close to the citizen and the structure that take care of it are spread through the territory. To better clarify this transformation that we hope and we wish for health center, we take an example in the library for two reasons. The first is that they represent an identity building for the community, and the second one is that they are no longer just a paper archive, but now, and is since 30 years and more, are square for meeting, exchange, and interactive learning. Everybody know this kind of reality, and we have in all the Europe this kind of library transformed in this way. So we hope also for, in this sense, make this kind of parallel. Since the pandemic, the healthcare center have to be transported in community hub, where people go not only to take care of their health, but to have an urban reference point in which to build a community. And specifically on the topic of regeneration, so healthcare center as a reference point in the city and urban regeneration starting point, we want to identify 6 topics as the ones on which as an architect can work specifically.
Yes, so from the architect and urban planner point of view, Among the themes, we articulated these points that could make healthcare centers become new poles of urban identity for an urban regeneration. So healthcare centers should constitute new urban centralities in the cases where there aren't existing ones, or strengthening existing realities, so creating new urban centralities. They should be integrated with other public services. They should structure the urban public space. They should reuse existing buildings with high identity characteristics, also with the aim of environmental sustainability and less soil consumption. They should have a good architectural and interior architectural quality. And they should be flexible to be used in pandemic and, of course, non-pandemic scenarios. So, from our point of view, it would be ideal that the design of an healthcare center respected all these conditions. But in our research, we meanwhile outlined an atlas of healthcare centers of national and international origin. We are illustrating, obviously, only a few of them now. These case studies respect for us one or more of the conditions told before. And in this case, in the Spanish context, we have this Centro de Salud of Gibraleón, where and that we find it interesting because it creates a further piece of city, and it relates with this pre-existence of this arena, and has well for its high architectural quality. Here we can find the words of the architect that talks about the existing correlation, the classical existing correlation between health and other public functions of the city in history. In the British context, the Waldron Healthcare Centre, while putting the health function at the center, also structures a new public square designed around a new civic center framed by other public services and also well-being centers and shops. So we find it particularly interesting for this reason. This is a different case. While not being a proper healthcare center, the new entrance of Careggi Hospital in Florence opens the theme of health to the city, demolishing the symbolic and also physical wall between the hospital and the urban center, and placing a large covered square with shops and other public functions under it, creating so a pedestrian plaza. Here we can see other cases that are interesting for the reuse of significant existing buildings. This is the case of the health center of the Poort van Born in the Netherlands, which is a conversion of a church that is particularly interesting from the point of view of the quality of the project, and also led to the improvement of the neighborhood, encouraging sociality and the feeling of aggregation. Here we have the Matasur Community Health Center in Chile, so in an extra-European context. And it's also another case of reuse of an historical building, which was a school, and so it was already known by the community. And the architects here created a space for the patients and for the community. Here we have three examples from the Emilia-Romagna region in Italy. This first one is Casa della Salute in Carpaneto, and it's a new construction, but it is positioned between two other public functions, just outside the town center. and it's built around a courtyard system with a pre-existing tree, creating a public place that can be used not only by patients and users of the healthcare centers, by all citizens. The Casa della Salute, so healthcare center in Finale Emilia, is interesting because it is located in the historical center and designed within a building complex that previously housed a hospital. So it is already familiar to the population as the place of care, and his identity and recognizability are strong and bring the element of treatment and prevention back to the center of the city. The last one is a different case. It has no external relationship with the city, but actually on the outside it relates with the city of Bologna in this case, like a peripheric shopping center. So it has a large parking lot outside, and like it creates no relation with the city like the previous cases. But we found it interesting for its internal spatial articulation around an internal courtyard. So here we can see some images of inaugurations of these and other Italian healthcare centers that saw a large citizens' participation, which is symbolic of how they could become identitary places for the community and the people. So through the description of this limited number of case studies, of course we studied more than only these, it seemed possible to begin to bring out issues with which the healthcare centers have already begun to confront in the pre-pandemic dimension, anticipating requests made even more evident by the new scenario with which the project is now confronted. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you for organizing this symposium in presence. It's fantastic. And so, yes, indeed, we will talk about this book, which was co-published by our agency, TVK. And it was published during the Venice Biennale. And this is the first time in our busy schedule that we can present it and discuss it. So we'll mainly talk about chapter 5, which is in the Faire belt. And this is research on retroactive manifestos. So we looked at the installation, the settlement of human beings on different parts of the planet. And the 5th chapter is the chapter in the Faire belt, la ceinture de feu, which is this geographical area which gives you images of instability. And to tell you about the main parts of our research, we began with this idea brought to us by all the biologists and scientists that Earth is highly unstable in the cosmos, with the sphere that was represented by Kircher, all the different elements which are in permanent interaction with each other. And so we were interested in the place of human beings in this unstable structure, with the following idea, that is the presence of human beings, just as that of other human beings, is something that is dynamic here, and that it would lead to some over-instability. So this is this exponential curve which shows the trajectory of the world population, CO2 concentrations, food production, and we can see that intertwining between the evolution of human beings and the evolution of the Earth with the issues we have today, climate change, the crisis in biodiversity, etc. With this idea that is that because of architecture, this will to live and protect ourselves from risk, we've tried to stop the movement of the Earth, its instability, and to thwart it, we need energy. And the more energy we require to thwart it, the more instability we create, we cause. So we wanted to start from the thinkers that were mentioned earlier on by Chris Eunice, thinkers who have thought about human beings and nature with this figure of Gaia that was mentioned, with the work of James Lovelock. So Gaia, that symbolizes this earth in movement. And the central hypothesis of this book is to start from the giants. And in the Greek mythology, they are the children of Gaia. And throughout the history, they become parts of the earth. They become the terrestrial powers, volcanoes, mountains. And so we have studied this notion of giants in Greek mythology. We have applied it to all the supernatural beings that you find in all kinds of narrations that allow human beings to create a fictitious dialogue, but to create and to integrate in their narrations all kinds of phenomena which are related to the instability of the earth. And that's what I wanted to tell you in my introduction. And by looking at these settlements, narrations and stories, and by looking at the first traces we have of this in the antique era, the evolutions, we've seen the relationships between the human beings and the earth, how these terrestrial powers evolved. I'm going to give the floor now to Alexandre, who's going to talk about this territory, la ceinture de feu. So this site, this is the place of the disaster. This is how we try to consider it and to follow the thread, to understand this part of the world. Human beings facing this disaster. If we go back in time, the ceinture de feu, the fire belt, is caused by the dislocation between Earth and the sea. And you can see here in this drawing that it was just one circle that dislocated, that broke up, and all around the Pacific Rim you have the borders between the Earth and the sea. This fault, which is 40,000 kilometers in length, so therefore the length of the equator, with the theoretical imaginary line which divides the Earth into two halves in the center. So these two dimensions, but it's an active margin that concentrates most of the terrestrial seismic activity with 45 active volcanoes. So that is the place of the disaster, and that is where you have 1 billion people living. So therefore, the initial disaster did not stop the habitation by human beings of this area. And there were several steps in this habitation, and mythology tried to give a thread on what all happened on this appropriation. So this book is built chronologically from the ancestral times until today, and so we can follow things from Polynesia, from Tahiti, Hawaii, between Tahiti and Hawaii. Then we will talk about Tokyo and San Francisco, and then the Marshall Islands, and more specifically Tokyo and Chile, Calama, therefore the other side of the Pacific Rim. So the first story of the Polynesians, this is how they live with this instability. And the second, the cities, it's the story about this instability, how to thwart it. And Calama, this is the current crisis and the readjustment, how we can interact with the terrestrial elements. So, as we can see, as David was saying in his introduction, the instability brought in by human beings. And the instability to form this archipelago with a simple and light infrastructure, that is the little boats. And from island to island, Polynesians went from Australia to Chile, and they took ownership of this vast territory, the Pacific Ocean, through very simple means. They went from island to island, and they would even go back to the previous islands. So they created a very vast territory. And if you link it up with mythology, this story is narrated by Namaka and Pele, who are two sisters. And one of them, Pele, whom you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen. And that isn't Namaka on the left, but it is a reference to the Greek god who narrates the story. This is to compare with the giants and other mythology. So Pele is at the center of this ownership, the creation of these Polynesian islands, and she's the goddess of fire and volcanoes. And her sister, Namaka, is the goddess of storms and water. And so in this conflict, you will have the formation of the Polynesian islands, because Namaka would send storms to the islands, and Pele and her brothers and sisters would escape from one island to another thanks to a little boat, pirogue. And each time Pele goes to an island, she plants a stick in the soil, and the lava would thus come up to the soil and create a volcano. So she created a volcanic archipelago, and this narration talks about this duality between water, the islands, and the volcanoes. And then you have this infrastructure, which is this boat, this pirogue, which is at the origin of this archipelago. So this is what we see. And this is the first way of apprehending this instability. And it is done in a very simple and resilient way, because there's always the possibility of going back while you're progressing. So in this type of ancestral mythology, the giants have a very structuring role to play in this settlement. They're not just here as a decoration, as some giants in other stories. We don't have the time to tell you all about this, but with the arrival of rationality, there's lots of meaning for these figures. And here you have a whole set of figures that shows the complexity of the relations, the chain reactions, and the human beings are there in the middle of it all. So therefore, they took ownership of this archipelago. And let's take a leap in time. In the 19th century, we had the emergence of the first cities, and the way in which they cross the Pacific Ocean is through a steamboat. And so here you have a stronger means of transportation from one end to the Pacific to the other end. So very quickly, we saw the energy and the means to take ownership of the Pacific Ocean, which were very strong, and the instability of the territory. Well, that did not change. So here we were quickly confronted to new types of disasters. And here we see earthquakes, 17 years apart from each other. one in 1906 and another one in 1923 between San Francisco and Tokyo. So both of them are along this active fault. And during these earthquakes, the cities are larger, so the disaster is worse. But the disaster is not just seismic. It is also a question of energy, because during the workshops, all the cables break down, the gas pipes that provide and supply light to the cities are cracked, etc., and they are burst, and these cities are burnt down. Actually, the destruction comes from the city itself, and it's due to this over instability rather than the original seismic issue. And here's another leap in time. And here we see the re-emergence of a giant figure that is very useful to understand a given situation. So here we are in Tokyo. From 1945 onwards, there was this terrible drama in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first atomic bomb exploded then. And then in 1954, there is another phenomenon that's going to create a lot of turmoil among the Japanese population. And Japanese people who were fishing went past the atomic tests carried out in the Marshall Islands, and they saw an atomic bomb explode far, and they went back to the harbor, and they were all eradicated, and they all died. And so today this is still visible as a symbol of a nuclear disaster followed by the Japanese. And this is where the narration takes another form. So that year, after this disaster, we see Godzilla appearing in the movies. So Godzilla is a monster. And I'm sure most of us have seen this film. And so this creature is a prehistorical animal coming out from the deep seas, and he's awakened by these atomic tests, and he comes out of water, he goes onto the Japanese archipelago, and he starts destroying absolutely everything without any reason, without any apparent reason. And then his feet get caught up in the cables, and the Japanese here are trying to find a way to destroy it. But since his breath is radioactive, he himself is radioactive, and they do not have enough power to counteract his radioactivity. So the two energies, the previous energies like oil and electricity, are confronted to nuclear energy, and it is in this conflict that Godzilla becomes the destructive force of the nuclear, and this is the demonstration of the sheer force of the nuclear power. And so what is important here is that that year Japan had started upon its mission to master atomic energy, and they started setting up a protocol to create nuclear power plants that will be commissioned 10 or 15 years later in 1966. So that is when you have the nuclear power as a destructive energy, and you have the shifting towards nuclear energy, a way to master this instability. So this creature, Godzilla, is a catharsis in the ambiguity of these two powers, and it's related to all the issues related to power and energy. And he cannot be killed in this story, so they're searching for sufficient power to kill it. And that is where we go back into mythology. And so we have to live with Godzilla. And it's a way for the Japanese to learn that they have to live with their nuclear power plants that they are developing. And so there's this duality, like Pele and the volcanoes and Godzilla. We have to live with Godzilla once we've created it. And there'll be some 30 sequels to this first film, and it is one of the greatest feature films that we have. Now let's go on to the last sequence. I do not know if we're taking too long or not. So Calama, another leap in time, 50 years later. Calama in the Atacama Desert in Chile. Right in the middle of the desert, there's a mine that you can see on the top. You can see the dip with some relief around. The largest open mine. So Calama, right in the middle of the desert. Very arid and hostile desert for human beings. It's become a large city, 250,000 people because of the wealth produced by this mine. And the living conditions are very unstable because the mine is polluting, creating all kinds of atmospheric pollution issues. And there are sandstorms, dust storms, because the region is a very dry region, because in the past it was an oasis, and the dust created also by the mine. And so here you can see the different phases of human settlement in this region. And in spite of the difficult conditions, it's been inhabited since immemorial times. Similar to our European antique era, it was inhabited by Atacameno Indians, and they live along this river called Aloha, which has its source in a volcanic plateau, which is the Minho volcano, and it crosses this very dry desert. This is the high plateaus close to the volcano, which is a place for grazing land. And then it goes down towards the sea, and here you can see it is there are lots of ups and downs, and you have a whole series of oases. And you have all the cities mentioned on the map along the river, and you have a whole archipelago of oases. And you have some natural phenomena occurring because of the rainfall. There's the El Niño phenomenon. The rainfall therefore varies hugely, and when there is a drought, water is polluted because there's a phenomenon occurring in the river. And so they've lived with these phenomena, pollution phenomena, and thanks to the flexibility of the structure of the archipelago, they could move to other parts and recreate another archipelago, another island, another oasis. So the phenomena that are related to the exploitation of copper and the mines, and here you need a lot of water, and they use the table waters, and there are certain effluents of the Aloha. So this mine was created at the end of the 19th century by Siemens. And today it's a public state-owned company. So this mine is amplifying these phenomena of water pollution. It's made the situation worse, and now industrialists are playing on this to defend the idea that they are polluting the river, because they're saying that there are some natural processes. Arsenic is being formed because of certain chemical reactions. And so this mine transformed this archipelago of oases, and you have the city of Calama at the center, attracting and drawing all the populations from the other areas, because all the other cities are polluted and suffer drought and have no more water. So this is the open mine, open air mine. And in 2011, there were protests from miners. Before 2011, they wanted better working conditions. But in 2011, there was a real revolution, if I may say so, in the whole of Chile. And here, these are the people from the city who protested and supported the miners. And they wanted to create a power struggle with the state industry. And they obtained a certain number of guarantees regarding this mine. And this mine will be buried in dust. And they committed to find water elsewhere by desalinating seawater so that the aloe might recover its normal course. And there was an urban project carried out by the Elemental Agency. It's a very simple project that is to work on the water to put the Aloha River at the center of the possibility of being able to live in this area and restore all the channels, because in Calama, this oasis system is such that it got degraded because of the growing of the city. Well, they haven't found a miracle solution, but they have made it more livable, and there are certain driving forces, trees creating microclimates, creating a barrier against dust, and thus the Aloha River was put back as a central element, and there was a better interaction with the river. And what I've omitted is that in the ancestral local culture, the river and the volcano would work hand in hand. There was a ritual. Each year they would clean the channels, irrigation channels, right up to the Niño volcano. And this ritual is still on in spite of the Christianization of the populations, the conversion into Christianity of these populations. And there's a more religious meaning, but it is important to maintain the territory and the infrastructure in this very arid and dry area. And here there aren't any giants like Godzilla, but there's this river that it has more central place, and in the future it might be a reason to acquire certain rights. And so this image of the giant was used to talk about this current phenomenon. The terrestrial elements are becoming real points of debate in the legal area. And I'd just like to return to my paper to conclude. Now, to conclude, the thread here is to show the archipelago under different angles. Here you have an archipelago which is along a slope, and it is the river that is the condition for this archipelago. In the Polynesian islands, the water was not on a slope, it was flat, horizontal. So that created other conditions for the archipelago. And what comes out here the instability, therefore, is due to the force of the archipelago, which can deploy itself rapidly and retract itself. And what remains in all these stories along the Pacific Rim is this structure in the form of an archipelago. And it can change in different forms that we still cannot suspect. And this slopey architecture is very unique, very singular. And we were interested in this archipelago. We talked about other times. Mrs. Colas and Junger would talk about it in different ways. And here it is dynamic. It is not spatial. with open spaces. Here it is more dynamic in time. And here you have this human infrastructure that can last and that can change. And it is this nimbleness, this temporal thinking that is useful in these territories, in these areas where we will also be living in very soon from now. And so this agility, temporal time agility, is very important in this archipelago.